He pointed, sneered, and said she didn't belong there, not in his first class, not in that seat, not in his world. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply sat still, her back straight, her gaze calm, and her silence louder than the arrogance pressing against her from the seat beside her. Her name was Ava Monroe, and what the man next to her didn't know, what would unravel every ounce of entitlement he carried, was that her last name wasn't just a name. It was stitched into the leather of the seat he occupied, etched into the logo on the boarding pass, and engraved on the wings of the aircraft itself. Because Ava's father, Charles Monroe, didn't just own the airline, he built it from the ground up. And now, at 36,000 feet, the skies this man thought he ruled were hers by legacy. This isn't just a story about race or class. It's about dignity, restraint, and the quiet power of knowing who you are, even when others forget to ask. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or judged before you had the chance to speak, stay right here, because what unfolds next will land harder than any words he ever spoke. Ava Monroe was 27, and she moved through the world like a quiet current, steady, graceful, and deeply aware of the space she occupied. She didn't crave attention, but it often found her anyway. Beneath her tailored beige suit and elegant posture was a lifetime of expectations carried with dignity, and emotional armor crafted from years of being seen only for her skin, not her merit. But Ava had been raised differently. Her father taught her that truth didn't need an audience and power didn't need noise. "You don't have to speak loudly if you already know the truth," he had told her again and again, and she wore that wisdom like a second skin. Charles Monroe was a self-made giant in the world of aviation, a man who built an empire with discipline, vision, and the kind of quiet poetry that raised a daughter to lead without needing to be seen. He had done it all as a widower, balancing corporate responsibility with fatherhood and their bond. Ava's and his was woven more in looks and gestures than words. They rarely traveled together. It was something they agreed on, quietly. Ava didn't want special treatment, and Charles respected that. Even on Monroe Airlines, the company that bore their name, Ava flew like anyone else, booking her own seat, refusing the VIP tag. That day, she boarded the flagship aircraft alone. The flight cabin glowed with polished chrome, rows of wide leather seats, chilled air vents above, and subtle lighting along the ceiling. It was a space designed to separate, to suggest, without saying it, who belonged and who didn't. Ava stepped into it calmly, nodded politely at the flight attendant, and made her way to her window seat. She folded her coat with care, crossed her legs, and sat with the serene stillness of someone who noticed everything but spoke only when it mattered. A few minutes later, Walter Briggs entered the cabin. Mid-60s, dressed in an expensive suit that tried to do the talking for him, he paused as he saw her. His steps faltered just slightly. He didn't say anything at first, but the flicker of disbelief in his eyes said more than words could. He glanced at her seat number, then at her again, as if double-checking the universe. A subtle furrow appeared between his brows. It wasn't just confusion, it was judgment. Ava felt it. She always did. The kind that didn't come from direct confrontation, but from centuries of assumption passed off as routine. Walter sat down beside her, sighing loudly as if to make a point. The flight hadn't taken off yet, but something in the air had already shifted. Ava didn't move. She didn't react. She simply sat back, folded her hands over her lap, and looked out the window, letting silence do what words never could. The cabin gradually filled as passengers stowed bags and took their seats, the quiet shuffle of boarding routines humming around Ava like distant noise. But next to her, Walter Briggs grew increasingly unsettled. He kept glancing at her with sharp, quick looks, his discomfort sharpening like static in the confined air. His jaw twitched every time someone greeted her or when the flight attendant offered her a glass of water. Finally, he leaned toward the attendant and muttered, just loud enough for Ava to hear, "There must be a mistake. She's in first?" The attendant, maintaining professionalism, checked the manifest and nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Miss Monroe is confirmed in 1A. Walter frowned, holding the silence as if trying to intimidate it. "Right," he said curtly, and the air around him stiffened. Turning toward Ava now, he addressed her slowly, as if she might need help understanding. "Is this your seat, miss?" His tone dripped with condescension, a forced civility masking disbelief. Ava turned slightly, met his eyes with calm precision, and replied softly, "It is." Her voice was steady, measured, quiet, unbothered, but something about that composure only made Walter more uneasy. He stared harder, searching for cracks, and finding none, he lowered his voice and hissed, "You don't look like someone who belongs here." The words didn't pierce her. They scratched. They didn't shock her. They exhausted her. Ava turned back to the window, her gaze settling on the wing outside. After a long, loaded pause, she answered, "I hear that often. Doesn't make it true." Her restraint should have ended it, but it didn't. It never did. Walter's voice sharpened. "You people always—" But Ava didn't let him finish. She lifted her hand gently, not to confront, not to argue, but to halt the descent of the moment. It was graceful, composed, final. Across the aisle, passengers froze, their magazines lowered, their ears perked. The tension rose like cabin pressure, thick, invisible, and undeniable. No one said anything, but everyone was listening now. Walter leaned back in his seat, scoffing, muttering something unintelligible under his breath. He assumed the show was over. He assumed wrong. At that same moment, in a private terminal beneath the jet bridge, Charles Monroe checked his phone. A short, coded message blinked across the screen. "Incident on board. Ava, row 1. No details, just enough to shift his heartbeat." He stood without a word, adjusting his watch, and walked toward the aircraft. No announcements, no rush, just presence. And in that quiet, he carried with him more than a name. He carried the weight of a lesson long overdue. Midway through the flight, a soft chime broke the stillness overhead, followed by the captain's calm, polished voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome a very special guest on board today, Mr. Charles Monroe." The cabin reacted as if struck by a current. Gasps slipped from parted lips, heads turned, and whispers flickered through the rows like sparks. In seat 1A, Ava didn't flinch. She had known he would come. She didn't need the announcement to confirm it. She could feel his presence even before it entered the aisle. Walter, on the other hand, shifted visibly. His jaw tightened, shoulders tensed, and his fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, as if something invisible had suddenly made the air too thick to breathe. From the rear of the cabin, Charles Monroe emerged. He wasn't in a suit that begged for respect. He wore a simplicity like armor, walking with the kind of confidence that came from building something lasting. His steps were measured, slow, and filled with quiet weight. Every eye tracked him, Not out of fanfare, but because his presence asked for attention without demanding it. He walked past wide eyes and held breaths until he reached the front, his gaze fixed on one person. He paused beside Ava's row and turned to the flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "May I speak to my daughter?" The words hung in the air like a dropped pin. Walter turned, stunned. "Your daughter?" The shock drained the color from his face. He suddenly looked smaller, as if the leather seat beneath him had turned brittle. Charles turned his eyes to Ava, and all the intensity in his stance softened in that one glance. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice carried no panic, just the calm of a man who'd raised a daughter to handle storms without breaking. Ava nodded gently. "He thought I didn't belong," she said, her tone even, her words more factual than wounded. Charles turned to Walter now, fully, his frame, casting a shadow that felt both protective and commanding. "Sir," he began, each word deliberate, "this airline has been my life's work. Every route, every detail, from the leather on your seat to the light above your head, was a vision we built together." He gestured toward Ava without breaking. Eye contact. "My daughter helped design this cabin. She shaped this experience. She is Monroe Aviation." Walter opened his mouth, perhaps to excuse, perhaps to stammer an apology, but the silence between them wrapped around him like a curtain. No more yelling, no more smugness, just the dull hum of altitude and the reality of his error closing in. Around him, Ava sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment she let the silence stretch, not because she was unsure, but because she had earned it. Then she turned slightly toward Walter, meeting his stunned expression with clarity. "I'm used to people talking at me," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Not to me, but I'm not here to explain myself anymore." And with that, she turned back toward the window, reclaiming her view, her space, and her story, all without ever leaving her seat. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence, but the air around Walter Briggs had shifted completely. He sat stiffly now, no longer leaning into arrogance but sinking beneath the weight of a truth he hadn't anticipated. Across from him sat the woman he had reduced to a stereotype, the woman whose presence he had questioned without pause, only to discover she was not only worthy of the space but had helped build it. His face drained of color as realization set in, not just of who Ava Monroe was, but what she represented. As the murmurs settled into reverent quiet, Ava sat motionless, her profile outlined by the glow of sunlight through the aircraft window. And then, for a brief, flickering moment, memory returned. A quiet flashback of a much younger Ava, seated at the edge of a long boardroom table, swinging her legs beneath a chair far too big for her. She had watched her father stand before a panel of doubtful executives, his voice never raised, his back never bent, as he walked them through a vision they couldn't yet see. "Presence matters more than volume," he had told her afterward. "People will forget what you say. They won't forget how you held your ground." Another memory surfaced. Her father brushing the curls from her face when she was still small, when she had come home crying after someone at school had said she didn't look like she belonged in ballet class. "They'll always ask why you're here," he had whispered. "Make sure you never forget who brought you." In seat 1A, Ava sat tall, not because she had something to prove, but because she never had to. Around her, passengers began to shift, not in discomfort, but in awareness. The man behind Walter lowered his eyes. The woman, seated just behind Ava, leaned forward slightly and whispered, with sincerity trembling in her voice, "I hope my daughter grows up to be like you." Charles turned one last time to Walter and nodded once, not in anger, but in quiet finality. "Some lessons come late," he said. "Let this be one of them." Then he walked away. No dramatics, no lingering glance. Just enough. The twist wasn't loud. It wasn't humiliating. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. The woman Walter tried to displace didn't need to reclaim her seat, because it had never been taken from her. It had always been hers, not because of wealth or power, but because she earned her place through grace, patience, and unshakable identity. And in that truth, she sat, not above anyone, but beneath no one. Walter filed no complaint. He knew it. Wouldn't help. The rest of the flight passed in silence for him. Not the composed silence of dignity, but the heavy, exposed silence of a man who had been forced to see himself clearly for the first time in years. The seat he had once guarded, with arrogance, now felt like a cage, a confining space that no longer elevated his status but mirrored his smallness. He kept his eyes forward, never daring to glance at Ava again. The luxury he'd once worn like armor now sat awkwardly on his shoulders, stripped of its power by a truth he could neither argue nor escape. In the days that followed, Monroe Aviation released a quiet press statement, not to call attention to scandal, but to announce the launch of a new internal initiative called Elevate. It was a leadership and sensitivity program, designed not to punish but to rebuild, a long-term commitment to inclusive service, cultural awareness, and the kind of hospitality that treated dignity as standard, not a perk. The initiative would be led by Ava Monroe herself, though not from a podium or a viral video. She declined interviews, held no press conferences, and released no public statements. Instead, she led behind the curtain, writing, designing, and shaping the internal culture with the same quiet strength she had shown in Seat 1A. At home one evening, Charles handed her something small, wrapped in a worn cloth. Inside was an old, brass compass, tarnished by years but still functional. "This was with me in the early days," he said, "back when the skies didn't know our name. Keep it close, for the moments when you feel lost in rooms that try to forget who you are." Ava smiled, not with pride, but with understanding. She tucked it into her travel bag, sliding it beside a folded piece of paper she had kept for years. A poem she'd written in her early 20s but never shared. Its title was simple, deliberate. Altitude is a choice. Her transformation hadn't come with fanfare. It wasn't defined by a single confrontation, but by the steady, rooted evolution of someone who knew who she was and refused to let the world shrink her. She hadn't changed the system by yelling at it. She had reshaped it with presence, with stillness, with that unshakable calm that made others stop, rethink, and listen. Ava's story didn't end in applause. It didn't need to. It ended in something deeper, in presence, in a woman who sat in a space that tried to reject her, not to prove she belonged, but because she had never doubted that she did. And, for everyone who watched her that day, whether with judgment or admiration, her silence said more than a speech ever could. Some moments don't echo with applause, they hum with clarity. Ava Monroe didn't raise her voice that day. She didn't argue, defend, or retaliate. She didn't need to. She sat still, calm and composed, and let her presence speak for her. And when the truth arrived, when her father walked down that aisle and the weight of her identity unfolded, it didn't roar. It simply stood beside her, undeniable and steady. If you've ever been spoken over, underestimated, or made to feel like you had to prove your right to exist in a space you earned, then this story belongs to you too. Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible, despite everything it took to get there? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your story. And if Ava's quiet strength left a mark, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that silence doesn't mean weakness. Because sometimes dignity is the loudest thing in the room, and greatness, it doesn't announce itself. It simply boards, takes its seat, and waits for the sky to catch up.